Aaron. It's good to see you and hear you.
Yes, it seems I was having a problem with my Surface. Well, I decided to go to my phone and prop up my phone instead.
I'm so glad that you will join us. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I was telling our audience that you are our first nonfiction author in the series.
Indeed,
We started off with a fiction writer, then we had a poet, and now we have you, which is quite delightful. And so, everyone, please welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Please welcome Aaron Kamugisha. He is the author of, among others, Beyond Coloniality, which was recently, and congratulations on this, longlisted for this year's OCM Booklist Prize. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Aaron has also been no stranger to the NGC Booklist Fest, as he has been a past attendant, and I believe he enjoyed his festival experience.
Oh, very much so. I was there for 2017 when I was a judge, and it was a fantastic experience.
Excellent. So now you've been on both sides of the judging process, having been a judge for deciding, which I think is a daunting task, just to think about which books of Caribbean literature are exceptional in any given year. And then on the other side of being judged. And so which would you say that you prefer?
Well, I think perhaps judging, because you get to learn so much from the different books you have. But yes, you're right, it is quite a task, because in judging, I believe my year, there were something like 40 entries. So you're reading 40 books and then developing a short list for that category of them and then an overall winner. So it's not for the faint-hearted indeed.
That's right. So I am sure that today's experience is not going to be arduous in any way. Quite the opposite, I hope. So I'd love for us to just get straight into things. If you would like to indulge us with a reading from any section of the book of your choice, we are all ears. And then we'll get into some questions.
Indeed. All right. So thanks to everyone who is part of the wider audience who is tuning in on the Sunday afternoon to listen to a talk of this nature. I have two sections which I wish to read for you. One comes from the introduction, just a couple of pages of the introduction that situate the work of it, and then the conclusion, a section from the conclusion that I'll read. So starting with the introduction from the very first page. The contemporary Caribbean, an area of experience that so many of its dispossessed citizens have given their lives and hearts to in the hopes of social transformation, is in a state of tragedy and crisis, destroyed and corrupted by a post-colonial malaise wedded to neocolonialism. This state of affairs is hardly unique and may well be seen as a condition of much of the post-colonial world, 2 generations after the promise of the Bandung Conference, which pointed to a horizon of true self-determination for people emerging from colonialism, and 50 years after the Tricontinental Conference of Solidarity of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the greatest summit ever held in the region against empire. The story about the Caribbean's retreat from a moment striving for revolutionary coherence in the 1970s to the decline and lethargy of our time is often tied to the advent of global neoliberalism, a global story in which we are all enmeshed. My claim here, though, is that the term neoliberalism flattens the complexity of the Caribbean's current moment. Rather, in the Caribbean, we see an amalgam of neocolonialism, post-colonial elite domination, and neoliberalism, which have undermined the conditions of possibility for any kind of social democracy, far less the democratic socialist experiments of a generation ago. We are thus left with anti-worker states, seduced and secured by client politics, and a lurking, ruthless authoritarianism. That is our political moment in the contemporary Caribbean and the terrain of struggle of this book, Beyond Coloniality, Citizenship and Freedom in the Caribbean Intellectual Tradition. And so Beyond Coloniality is a long meditation, I like to term it, on Caribbean thought, and it attempts to effect a challenging alliance. It discusses the social and political moment, complex in its territorial specificity, and not easily generalized across the region, while engaging radical Caribbean thought as a means to comprehend the coloniality of our present and to imagine a turn to a embattled future beyond coloniality. In Beyond Coloniality, a range of Caribbean theorists whose work is of inestimable value in understanding our present are closely considered. Among these, Jackie Alexander, Camille Brathwaite, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Paget Henry, Percy Hinson, Claudia Jones, George Lamming, Shalini Puri, Gordon Roulaire, David Scott. However, it's primarily a meditation on the work of two towering figures in the Caribbean intellectual tradition, C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter. The thought of James and Wynter is both mobilized in critique of a coloniality of a contemporary Caribbean and as an intimation towards a future beyond our current condition. The technique employed here, particularly in the chapters on C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter, is what intellectual historian Gary Wilder has called intellectual history as critical theory, in which the studied reflection on illuminating primary and, in some cases, unpublished documents, along with widely known texts, is considered with a constant reflective eye towards our present concerns in a conjunctural moment. The extraordinary range and commitment evident in the writings of both James and Wynter have left few of the conundrums of contemporary life untouched. It is through their writing that we see the best presentation of a method capable of providing both a profound critique of a contemporary Caribbean and a cultural survey, necessarily provisional and unsettled, future beyond coloniality. So, Beyond Caribbean Coloniality is thus a work on neo-colonial citizenship, coloniality and freedom, and the conundrums and despair of contemporary Caribbean existence. It is also about the epistemological uprising that must occur to effect human freedom beyond colonialism in the Caribbean. I devote entire chapters to James and Wynter because I believe that the future of a Caribbean radical tradition may lie somewhere between James, the anti-colonial Marxist and intellectual, and Wynter, the radical humanist, whose vision for human freedom beyond coloniality may be the most creative of any Caribbean thinker. The thought of James and Wynter is behind the critique of a contemporary Caribbean fashioned in every chapter. And so this book, in many ways, is a book on their work and on their thought, while simultaneously a meditation on the Anglophone Caribbean 50 years after 50 years of independence and post-colonial bourgeois domination. The meditation is consensually concerned with resuscitating the Caribbean radical tradition's critique of elite domination within the contemporary Caribbean. The Caribbean elites in the post-Grenada era seem to have forgotten that there is a Caribbean radical tradition. It, however, has not forgotten about them. Or as James put it in his contribution to the New World Quarterly's Guyana Independence issue in 1966, colonialism versus independence, slavery versus freedom. That is still the issue. So, that part is from the introduction, and I want to go straight from there to the conclusion. I'm going to read part of the conclusion, and then I'm going to have a bit of a conversation, and then I'm going to come back and read another 5 minutes, which takes us to the very end of the conclusion. But the part of conclusion I'd like to start with is all down on page 207, and it picks up a particular line of investigation by George Lamming on the question of Caribbeanness. And Lamming, in his 7 decades of intellectual work in the region, deeply engaged with the question of Caribbeanness. And to turn directly then to my reading, for Lamming, the natural impulse to exile by Caribbean people results in a moment in which migration is going to be very central to the psychology of a whole generation of people. Lamming's central place within that generation of Caribbean people who journeyed from London to London in the 1950s is too well known to tarry with much longer. But if we go to his collection, The Pleasures of Exile, he actually claims that the creation of a sense of Caribbeanness is a diasporic activity. So to quote Lamming, "No islander from the West Indies sees himself as West Indian until he encounters another island in foreign territory. The category West Indian, formerly understood as a geographical term, now assumes cultural significance." This moment was, as we can expect, could only be naive of what was to come. Caribbean people were, according to Lamming, journeying towards an expectation, going to a more elaborate extension of something we thought we knew. But their suffering, their isolation, and their need to forge community created a new people. This idea, of course, has achieved some popularity in Caribbean diasporic circles due to how well it captures the lived experience of new waves of migrants from the region to the metropolis, who, when faced with the pressures of minoritization and loneliness, found themselves often, though not always, shedding their inter-island rivalries in the quest for particular regional solidarity. However, I want to put a bit of pressure, and I do at the same point in the book, on Laming's formulation of diaspora and where diaspora, the idea of Caribbeanness, begins. Because in an interview and in his first reflections on his sojourn outside Barbados, they provide a very interesting contrast to his ideas of displacement in the Pleasures of Exile. So to return to my book, on his arrival in Trinidad in 1946, in house after house that Laming visited, he encountered the region through an assemblage of islands that constituted each family. So as Laming says, Father Grenada, Mother St. Vincent, one grandparent from Barbados. So struck was he by this regionalism in the intimate sphere of the family that he would note that his Caribbeanness begins in Trinidad, not in Barbados. This lived existential reality of Caribbeanness, coupled with the influence of Eric Williams, whose introduction to the work of Aimé Césaire Nicolas Guillen he never forgot, resulted in Laming's location of all of his novels after his first outside of one discernible territory in the region. A Caribbean sensibility emerges from the peculiarities of its historical formulation, similar to C.L.R. James's declaration that we in the Caribbean, more than any people, are structured by history. But comprehending the sensibility demands a careful attention to the place of feeling in our imaginations. Laming would famously call for the sovereignty of the imagination, in which cultural sovereignty would be, and I quote, the free definition and articulation of a collective self, whatever the rigor of external constraints, end quote. This is hardly a disavowal of the forces of colonialism, white supremacy, and economic exploitation that roar through the past and present Caribbean experience, but a recognition that sovereignty of the imagination is the amalgam of the pursuit of a style of freedom. And if you go from here to Laming's address, a great address called The Education of Freedom that he gave in 1982 in Carriacou, he states in this address that the education of freedom is vital to revolutionary artistic expression, as a central and seminal value of the creative imagination is that it functions as a civilizing and a humanizing force in a process of struggle. It offers an experience through which feeling is educated, through which feeling is deepened, through which feeling can increase its capacity to accommodate a great variety of knowledge. The tiny island of Carriacou, which inspired Laming to make this very great address, was also the setting of a great novel of African diaspora feeling, experience, and desire, Paul Marshall's Praise Song for the Widow. It was also the birthplace of one of the parents of the theorist whose remarkable work would go beyond Laming's yearning for a decolonized aesthetic of freedom. Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic, read in concert with Laming's Education of Feeling, alerts us to the depth of a colonization of feeling by patriarchal control. It demands a revolution in human relations that Laming and James also could only hazily perceive. For Audre Lorde, every oppressor must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. The horror of the capitalist, inhumane system within which we live, predicated on the exclusion of the psychic and emotional components that are human needs, are that it robs our work of erotic value, its erotic power, and life appeal and fulfillment. It is not for Lorde a wonder that men instinctively recoil against the erotic because they, I quote, fear this depth too much to examine the possibilities of it within themselves. The erotic as a life force of woman, this measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings, is a capacity that women possess, which C.L.R. James discerned men have got to learn. The erotic as creative energy empowered, the nurturer of all of our deepest knowledge, some of Lorde's signal contributions, shows a strange moment of commonality between these two very different theorists, Laming and Lorde, because Laming too understood, to quote him, knew that change will occur through making the body speak feeling. Lorde and Laming might very well agree on the statement that to educate and love is truly the function of the creative imagination. So I'm going to give you one more passage from the conclusion before I pause. And that passage is taken from Césaire, and it's a particular reading of Césaire's great poem, Lost Body. And Lost Body is taken from a 1950 collection of Césaire's by the same title. And it's a moment in which Césaire, the founder of negritude, the coiner of the word negritude, realizes that this house he has built for Black people, which he thinks will lead to their cultural sovereignty, called negritude, is not going to be enough. Because there's something about the tragic roots of being Black in a world which is governed by white supremacy, in which even negritude is not going to be enough for. And Césaire's solution to this is a very poignant revolt. And I'll quote part of Lost Body, give an interpretation, and then take a pause. So Lost Body, sections of it at some length. I who Krakatoa, I who bet everything better than a monsoon, I who outside the musical scale, I who Zambezi are frantic or rombos or cannibal, I would like to be more and more humble and more lowly, always more serious, without vertigo or vestige, to the point of losing myself falling into the live semolina of a well-opened earth. The wind, alas, I will continue to hear it, nigger, 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 from the depths of the timeless sky, a little less loud than today, but still too loud, and this crazed howling of dogs and horses, which it thrusts at our forever fugitive heels. But I turn in the air, shall rise a scream so violent that I shall splatter this whole sky, and with my branches torn to shreds, I shall command the islands to be. Césaire's despair at coloniality's persistence, the constant echo of its most humiliating terms for Black bodies, results in a resignation that Black people will be forever fugitive in a world whose fundamental premises remain colonial. His command is less an order than an entreaty, David Rudder's plea for a full self-actualization of his native land. The poet has a responsibility that he cannot disown with a flourish, as his prayer is to become the lover of this unique people, an ambition forged in diaspora, but with the self-determination of the Caribbean people at his heart. I'll pause it.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful and moving reading, Aaron. For those of you who are only now joining us, welcome again to Bios and Bookmarks. It's the NGC Focus Lit Fest online reading series featuring Caribbean authors, and we are joined here today by Dr. Aaron Kamugisha, who's speaking with us about his most recent publication, Beyond Coloniality, which was longlisted for this year's OCM Focus Prize. I felt that to begin our discussion, while spending time with your book, it felt particularly significant, not in the best way, for the Caribbean as the rest of the world to be gripped by COVID-19. And observing the responses of different Caribbean nation states to the coronavirus, which, no doubt you've been doing. Do you think that now is a potent time for us as a region, or perhaps if you want to respond from a Barbadian perspective, to truly engage with moving beyond coloniality in our response to this global pandemic?
Well, certainly. I think that the last couple of decades, even before we get to the moment we are, show us the necessity of doing so. We have had in the 21st century so far, it began with September the 11th and the consequent so-called war on terror, which showed the ways that so-called Western liberal democracies were willing to completely abridge the lives of a great deal of their citizens. That was followed by the second decade of the 21st century, and the rise of authoritarian governments throughout the world. And now we have a global pandemic, but a global pandemic in which we know that there are social and political conditions which have allowed this pandemic to actually foster and run wild in the way that it actually has. I think that the Caribbean has, on many levels, no choice but to move further towards all of the things that its most distinguished voices have been calling on for so long. A deepening of regional integration, a greater reliance on our own resources. The U.S. Department of Agriculture in 2007, I believe it was, actually stated in a report that the Caribbean is the most food import dependent region in the world. I mean, that is scandalous when you think about it. So the very conditions of the world, the turn away from globalization, the protection of the borders, the rise of straightforward fascism in many countries, the ways in which the totalitarian state is being reproduced over and over, certainly lends us to the conclusion that we need to actually deepen our understanding of what true self-determination for Caribbean people would be, rather than being, as I state in the book, content with neocolonial arrangements of power, which is what largely the rulers of the Anglophone Caribbean, from Jamaica to Guyana, are content with.
It was a revelatory and unexpected way to be reading Beyond Coloniality at the exact time when the Trinidadian government announced that all fast food outlets would close till, I believe it is the end of April, including, and paramount among them, the KFC. And kind of viewing the national desperation and frenzy that accompanied the closing of KFC, which Trinidadians who understand is emotionally and historically unprecedented, made me think of the book Lament, really, that of all that we have given up, I suppose, without realizing that we've given up, to arrive at a state of complete dependency on a foreign agent. This time it's of food, but I think it applies across the board.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly. I mean, I think that that says it very well. I mean, the Caribbean, of course, has always had a complex relationship with Western consumer products, and it has taken these, changed them, resemanticized them to fit its needs. It has also pioneered certain forms of leisure consumption within the West, from tobacco to sugar to contemporary carnivals and a great deal of Western popular music, which Western consumers have consumed too. So the Caribbean has always had that relationship to consumption within the world. The question becomes, when the Caribbean's resources are no longer able to actually sustain that level of consumption, what do we do? And how do we deal with consumption patterns that tie us even closer to neocolonial relations of power?
Audience, as you're listening to the discussion, I would like to encourage you, if you have questions for Aaron, thoughts or comments, we would love to hear them. So please leave them in the comment section below, and I will read them out as they emerge. So I'll keep an eye on that section there as we proceed. In the introductory chapter, you mentioned that one of the, if not the greatest saving grace of contemporary Caribbean thought are the contributions of women, female Caribbean scholars, and that was extremely heartening to read, because when we enter the book, it feels very much that we are understandably sort of point of crisis in the Caribbean as a region. And so I wonder if we could talk more about, for your reading practice, those Caribbean female scholars that have been hugely influential, who can be, like, I'm thinking of the contemporary ones, but any that you'd like to discuss, I'd love to hear about.
Okay. Yes, I think that the point I was also making in the book had to do with the question of Grenada and what has been happening in the Caribbean post-Grenada Revolution. There's a tendency by some figures among the left. I, at one point, even though I don't think so now, reproduced the same mistake in an early article of thinking that post-Grenada, the Caribbean had descended into a particular kind of post-colonial malaise and lethargy that had seen the end of not just socialist, a particular type of socialist experiment, but serious left organizing within the Caribbean. But of course, that's not so, because if we think about that period from 1983 to now, the greatest single contribution and change in the intellectual, the activist, the left atmosphere in the Caribbean, and the best progressive change has been, of course, a group of work, and I'm just giving it loosely this title because many figures within it may not necessarily see themselves as feminists, but a set of organization, a set of activism, a set of writing, a set of thought that we might call Caribbean feminisms. Okay, I'm always drawn to the fact that there is a lovely collection of interviews with Caribbean writers that was done by Darrell Cumberdance called New World Adams. It was published in 1992, but interviews were done in the very late 70s and early 80s. And she interviews both C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter, and I know both of their work very well, in the book. And the interviews are both conducted in 1980. And she asks them this question about what do you think of Caribbean women's writing? And they both basically give an answer of, oh, there's not really any such thing as Caribbean women's writing, okay? Which is an astonishing thing that they said. But the thing is, they said it in 1980. Neither of them would have said that same thing. Of course, James has passed by 1990, a decade later. Because the 1980s saw such an outpouring of incredible Caribbean women writers, the decade being bookended at the end with that first great collection of literary criticism of them, Carol Boyce Davies and Elaine Fido's Out of the Crumbler. But there was such outpouring of Caribbean women writers in the 1980s that even though there had been a number before, certainly the comparable work of Paul Marshall, Simone Schwartz-Bart, all of this work before, there was a way in which by the end of the 1980s, something had completely changed in the Caribbean literary landscape and continues apace now. So certainly as somebody who grew up in the 80s into the 1990s, I was highly influenced by this work, by the African-American woman novelist Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, the Caribbean woman novelist also, but also as something that I wasn't reading as an add-on, but as a generative part of what I understood the Caribbean intellectual tradition to mean and to be. So when I was approaching Caribbean social and political thought, Caribbean feminist work or work in what is largely called gender studies in the Caribbean was not an add-on or something on the side. It's something that I saw as constitutively part of the tradition. So I could approach the work of Jackie Alexander, for example, who's enormously influential on my work, as simply a writer who is writing the most discerning and brilliant new work on citizenship and coloniality in the Caribbean at that point in time, in the early 2000s when I was starting my doctorate. So that I would say is the kind of relationship and the kind of reflection I would have on that body of work.
What do you think is, it's probably near impossible to summarize in a tiny soundbite, but it occurs to me that this book is a gargantuan study of the thoughts and theories of other writers, scholars, and thinkers. And certainly, I can't possibly speculate as to the time it would have taken to bring the work to completion must have been a mammoth undertaking. And one of the most pressing questions I find that I have after spending time with the book is, do you think there is something distillable, something, I hesitate to say small or simple, but something vital that can be done at the level of every Caribbean household to bring us out of the disease of neocoloniality?
I think that what that would mean, and politics is a fundamentally social and community activities. So there's always a danger when one then brings it back to the question of the individual. But I think there is always a question or a commitment, okay, that has to be had towards interrogating on every level of the structure the neocolonial realities that we face and what they mean for people's personal human relations, what they mean for the relations of power that we all have with others, and what they mean for the type of work and that one does. I mean, we are all going to be called at some point to make a contribution to, however small, to dismantling the edifice of our contemporary society and working for human freedom beyond it. And one of the things I think is vital to appreciate is that we don't do it for ourselves. We do it as a marker and a contribution and a gift for future generations who are going to come after us. Because if we continue to see it as being just about us, then we will forever fall into a particular kind of individualistic neocolonial trap, which is something which our ancestors did not do. Many of the scholars that I interrogate and I think with, they knew that the possibilities of living in a non-racist world or a non-sexist world or a non-imperial world would not occur within their lifetime. But they did their work and they dedicated their lives as a contribution to us so that we could continue to take this thing further. And so that is what I would say becomes important and becomes crucial at the level of the individual.
Thank you. That's so beautifully said. I think it's a perfect moment for us to go into your final reading.
Okay, thank you. So the final reading is basically, in large part, the last 2 pages from about 213 paragraph 2 onwards. The Caribbean, partly due to its unique history of colonialism and the intimacy of the size of its polities, has the potential to create that free community of valid persons that Martin Carter yearned for. Carter knew that the time of this crisis, his own Burnham's dictatorship in Guyana, could not be the excuse for anomie and paralysis of the spirit. But the search for this community will remain elusive if our state managers remain enthralled to the dictates of global capital and deny a style of thinking that places at the center of its reflection the evolution of individual and community. This is not to suggest that the overturning of the realities of colonial citizenship that I've detailed in this work can be done without a concerted effort to engage in and win political struggles. The Caribbean left with a memory of, but not burdened by Grenada, must find its way back to revolutionary socialism. Or have the Caribbean's neocolonial status continue until imperial globalization formally dismisses even the fiction of national sovereignty. The stakes of our struggle, the disappointment of past failures by the Caribbean left, sharpen the need to have a clear understanding of the new socialist society we wish to create. Founded on the destruction of capitalism, without which there will never be any social justice, a demand for reparatory justice for the crimes of colonialism, a voice to the world for peace, a resolute commitment to gender justice, and an end to the march towards the planet's environmental destruction. Rather than sorrow, our history illuminates our chance to proffer a mold of existence in human sociality that the world continues to desperately need, from one small part of it, small perhaps in its territorial expanse, but vast in the size of its heart. The venture beyond coloniality has been to show the Caribbean intellectual tradition at its finest, especially a group of thinkers who are vanishing from this sphere of existence every year, and who have produced a remarkably insightful body of work that in its denunciation of exploitation and quest for truly human, in winter sense after Western man, relations, has global resonance and appeal. From its opening sentence, and even more in this conclusion, beyond coloniality has been a quest to remake the Caribbean anew, and also about that most elusive of human emotions, love. Love, as June Jordan once wrote Alice Walker, is a single true prosperity of any moment. Love, as Richard Eiton knew, is a subversive gift, an important public good, and loving is a significant political act, as particularly among those stigmatized as marked as unworthy of love and incapable of commitment. Césaire would entreat his heart to preserve me from all hatred in his quest to become a lover of this unique people. Che Guevara would remark that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. We must strive every day so that the love of living humanity for that will be transformed into actual deeds. Laming says that politics is a ground for that universal human sympathy. Yet in the education of feeling, he cannot help but face the unavoidable question of the awareness that will create the resolve that will make political and personal sacrifice possible. The case for Caribbean freedom through a regionalism anchored to anti-colonial will has now been made for over a century. What impulses, what species of desire might make its pull too irresistible to forfeit yet again? My reading of Caribbean thought suggests that its urgent belief is that the Caribbean must create itself anew. This transformation will mean a different political economy, political arrangements beyond the reification of petty bourgeois domination, an entirely different structure of feeling in the realm of our public and private citizens' lives. Caribbean solidarity in the interests of self-determination and human freedom, like its sibling, Black solidarity, has never existed outside a labyrinth of contradictions, persistently troubled by the ongoing reproduction of coloniality. We are reminded, though, that the Black survival of coloniality is the ultimate beyond. It is a future we dreamed of and struggled towards by the Black radical tradition that each generation has to learn anew. When one considers the African and Caribbean experience through a diasporic lens, one great truth emerges. A people not meant to survive have consistently needed each other to survive. This applies whether we consider the Haitian revolutionaries ending slavery for the first time in the Western Hemisphere, the Jamaicans of 1832 precipitating the end of slavery for all in the British colonized West Indies, or the Africana world in uproar over the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy in 1935. It is impossible to imagine Caribbean spirituality without Africa and India, the humanization of the Caribbean landscape without Indian indentured worker, labor, Kwame Nkrumah without CLR James or George Padmore, negritude without the Harlem Renaissance, or Garvey without the entire diaspora. This is a diasporic sensibility that rings out clearly from centuries of Caribbean history. It may well be the mobilizing principle for future socio-political movements yet to come. A great poet, Kamal Brathwaite, has already summoned these contradictions towards political purpose in a statement as compelling as anything scribed in New World letters. And here I read Kamal and I end with Kamal. Know that the Middle Passage, with its tears of ancestors, sometimes wonderfully shared, is not only a voyage from death to life, or if you prefer, a journey from life to death. The Middle Passage of our years, beyond, hopefully, the Caribbean option block. It is above all a continuing, dialectical, not dialectical, experience and process. From home to whom, from home to whom, from origin to continuum, from love, my beloveds, to love. Right.
Thank you for that. I feel it's important to say how valuable spending time with this work has been to me. Like many non-academics, I certainly approached it with a healthy sense of trepidation. But I found, as you so beautifully expressed, that so much of the strivings for understanding in this work point to that exact elusive goal, that of love. And you express it so beautifully, not just in this concluding section, but throughout the book. And I feel, in fact, it is a right time to return to a reading of Prophet with your work in mind. So too with Lord, with Winter. You've given us a way to live anew with these Caribbean thinkers and workers, and for that I am extremely grateful. So that is something I wanted to make very clear. You're welcome.
And
Sorry?
One thing I should say that I did say in the last couple of pages is that I talk a lot about love, and on some level, the secret of love, and thinking through a number of Caribbean thinkers. But what I didn't actually say explicitly is that the great secret of love, as we all should know, is commitment. Okay? And it is that commitment of these Caribbean theorists I want to show to a new Caribbean. All right? And the legacy of that commitment, the refusing to be co-opted by something else, that is part of the spirit and the genesis of their thought. And that's one of the reasons why their work is considered so remarkable and is read all over the world by people quite far away from Caribbean concerns, but who understands that there is a depth of intercultural understanding twinned with an anti-colonial politics, which most people and many people in the world yearn for, and is found at its finest in the work of the great Caribbean thinkers.
I could not agree more. I feel like our audience has been quiet, but they've been very receptive. They've been sending little heart icons throughout your readings, and I feel that a discussion of this nature really needs at least an hour and a half, 2 hours to really start to heat up. So
I'm not going anywhere.
I'm grateful for your indulgence with the unfortunate time restraints of the Instagram Live. Would let us take it far. But definitely before we conclude, I would like to play 3 envelopes game with you, which bio and bookmarks viewers, for those of you who've seen past episodes and know how this works. Each envelope has a question/provocation for our guest. And so Aaron will choose one. They're just numbered 1 through 3, and we will engage with the question and thing. So your choice.
I will choose the middle one. I can't see what number it is, but the middle. Yes.
It happens to be number 2. So.
Yes.
And in there, this is actually the question I was hoping you would. It is a magical night where you, Sailor James, and Sylvia Winter are seated at a table for 5. Who are the other 2 guests to make this dream dinner complete?
The other 2 guests. I'm going to go. I'm going to go with 2 other Caribbean guests, okay? Which makes it just slightly easier. And those Caribbean guests will be Franz Fanon and Simone Schwartz-Bart. Because Simone Schwartz-Bart, The Bridge of Beyond, is just a novel that I have read and taught so many times. And visiting her home once in 2012 in Guadeloupe was really one of my best experiences, during the Caribbean Studies Association conference. It's a book that I'm very, very, very fond of. And that conversation, I think, would be a great conversation. So I will go with Fanon and Simone Schwartz-Bart.
I'm incredibly biased towards Simone Schwartz-Bart. I think she was, and that book in particular, revealed that there was a vacancy in me that only the words of Caribbean women writers could fill. I think it was completely pivotal in my understanding of that truth, and has still guided the books that I seek out by women writers who I was unfortunate to be alive, though she's very much alive, and we will not put any slander on them. But certainly we will go with Paul Marshall, and though she's not Caribbean, but shares so much, I think, of Caribbean writing sensibility, Toni Morrison. There's so many writers that for me, I've come through that genesis of knowing them through the Bridge of Beyond. And so I think that's a beautiful point. I'm completely biased, but I think it's a beautiful point for us to wrap up on. We have a comment from Moses Sanatan saying, respect, Dr. Kamugisha, nice list. And then I couldn't agree more.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yes. And it's been a rare pleasure.
Thank you. I urge all readers, even if you think you are not cut out for reading academic books, to get a copy of Beyond Coloniality. It's published by the Indiana University Press. I believe it may be also available as an ebook. Certainly visit their site and have a look at what offerings the book comes in. I think it's a completely indispensable book for this time. For anyone who is a Caribbean citizen or interested in how the Caribbean can do better for itself, and as Aaron says, for the generations to come, absolutely indispensable reading. Thank you so much again, Aaron, for being here, and it's been a real pleasure.
Indeed. Thank you so much. And I look forward to more BOCUS events. And I hope if all of this madness has subsided on some level, that I will be able to see you in September. If not, definitely next year,
Fingers and toes and everything else first. Thanks, everyone, again for joining Bios and Bookmarks, covered by the NGC Books Lit. Please take good care of yourselves and your loved ones. Bye.